Hello and welcome back to GraphQL Fireside Chats. My name is Sarah Renaud with This.Labs. This event is part of a 4-part online series hosted with Hasura. Each week we will focus on GraphQL and a different front-end framework. This week is all about GraphQL and Vue. Our sponsors today are This.Labs and Hasura. This.Labs are your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Hasura is an open source engine that connects to your databases and microservices and auto-generates a production-ready GraphQL backend. You can read more about Hasura at hasura.io. Upcoming events. GraphQL Fireside Chats continue next week. Join us for GraphQL and Angular on August 11th. We have a very exciting GraphQL online conference, GraphQL Enterprise Connect on August 14th. Finally, our last GraphQL Fireside Chat with Relay will be happening on August 18th. For more information, check out graphql-meetup.com. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's Fireside Chat. Tanmai Gopal, founder of Hasura, Debbie O'Brien, head of learning and developer advocate at Nuxt.JS, and Natalia Tepluhina, staff front-end engineer at GitLab and Vue core team member. Welcome, everyone.
Hey.
And with that, I will pass things over to Tanmai.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Hope you didn't miss me too much. Thank you again for being here, and I am so happy and excited and honored to see familiar faces, Natalia and Debbie, who we met a few months ago in person, and so it's great that we get now meet online as well. So super happy to be hosting this chat. What we'll do is we'll maybe kickstart things with a few introductions, and then kind of take things from there. I am Tanmai. I am one of the founders at Hasura. We've been doing GraphQL for a while and seen all of the kinds of joys and pains with it, which I love talking about. I love learning about how GraphQL integrates with various ecosystems and how what kind of work to do remains there, and where GraphQL kind of fits in the developer toolkit. Natalia, would love to hear a quick introduction from you.
Sure. So I'm a Vue.js core team member. I care mostly about Vue documentation, and I work as a staff front-end engineer at GitLab. And if you wonder how this all relates to GraphQL, I'm the engineer who actually started working on the first GitLab application with GraphQL. I'm GitLab GraphQL expert. I'm kind of responsible for teaching our own engineers how to work with GraphQL, how to build stuff, and also I'm responsible for experimenting with GraphQL, trying new things, like migrating to newer versions, whatever. And in the world of Vue also, I'm contributing to Vue Apollo with guides and writing articles about my experiments, like latest one was, I think, about testing Vue components with Apollo. So that's me.
That's awesome. And are you also using Vue at GitLab?
Yes. This is our main framework.
Awesome. Debbie, would love to hear an introduction from you as well.
Okay. So I'm Debbie O'Brien, and I work at Nuxt.JS as head of learning and developer advocate. So I get to work with Nuxt.JS all day, which is very cool. I guess you could say I got introduced to GraphQL by having major fights with backend developers and having too many endpoints. And I went through all that pain and kind of said there has to be a better way, and discovered GraphQL. And oh my God, I can do it without backend developers. So that's, and I'm saying that in a nice way, right? So I'm in love with GraphQL because of that. And in Nuxt.js, because I'm head of learning, what my job is to make sure that everyone can use Nuxt and learn Nuxt with everything. So we're going to create Hasura tutorials and demos so that people can see how easy it is to combine these two technologies.
That's awesome. And how long have you been kind of using Vue, and what other things have you done in the Vue ecosystem before Nuxt as well?
Yeah, so I only learned JavaScript 3 years ago. So I guess I've been working with Vue 2.5 years now at this stage. And I started working with Nuxt because we needed server-side rendering, and I got told Nuxt is what you need, and then obviously just went straight into Nuxt, and now Nuxt for everything. So I speak at a lot of conferences about Nuxt, and you've probably seen me or heard me or watched me somewhere. And then I write a lot of blog posts as well on tutorials and everything to do with Nuxt, basically.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, so I think we're kind of going to talk about like several different things with like related to Vue and GraphQL and state management and caching and stuff like that. But would love to kind of kick things off by kind of getting a sense of what the API integration story has been like with Vue over the last few years, right? Even before GraphQL and after GraphQL, what that story has been like and how that story has evolved for Vue. And maybe Natalia, if you'd like to kind of take us over, what that has been like over the last few years.
Sure. So I will start with the REST API because it was a default for a long time. It's still default for many people so far. So with Vue 2, we started with our own library to handle just normal XML, like HTTP request and so on. It was Vue resource, and we supported it for around, I think, year and a half. Mm-hmm. It was nice, small library. It still works. Just in case you're using Vue resource, it's not deprecated, but it's not supported anymore. Because after this, we decided to provide more generic solution for people who are using REST API. So we turned to Axios, and it's already recommended by Vue documentation. So if you're going to use the REST API, use Axios. And what we recommended for bigger applications is using services or using Vuex actions. So it was like a very general recommendation, like don't make API calls directly from components, try to use services, have like an API layer, or just switch to Vuex actions, whatever. And speaking about GraphQL, I think the common standard right now for Vue is Vue Apollo. I understand that there are many GraphQL clients, like at least Relay and Apollo as the most popular, but the most famous, let's say, integration for Vue was Vue Apollo by Guillaume Cho. You probably know him as Acronym. And de facto, it's a standard right now if you use it with Vue. But let's also hear from Debbie, like what do they have on Nuxt from Nuxt modules?
Well, we don't actually, we have like obviously the Apollo module, right? So many people are using that, but it's quite a big module as well, especially if you're doing like just a simple thing. Say you're just getting data. Do you really need to put Apollo onto your website? Do you need it, into your packages? So for example, there's an easier way to do it with Nuxt because we can create plugins. So on my website, for example, I just created a plugin, and instead of using Axios, I'm using HTTP, and that's built into Nuxt. So basically, we just like create a very simple plugin, and now we're able to call Hasura and get all our data, and there's no Apollo, and there's no Axios, and it's like super small. So yeah, there are many ways. I need to write a blog post on it.
No, that sounds awesome. And like, what is kind of that? What has kind of been like the driver of the changes in those different ways of doing API integrations, all the way from like Vue resource to Axios to Vuex actions or services, across these three, at least maybe before GraphQL, what were kind of the drivers for these different patterns or different ways of integrating APIs?
I can say for Vue resource, we just decided that this is not really ergonomic to dedicate our own time and resources to support something that is not exactly Vue related or Vue specific. Because when you want to fetch data from the API, this should be kind of framework agnostic, right? That's why we recommended switching to Axios. So people could use the same tool they can use with Vanilla.js application or any other framework. And recommending using API layers was for bigger applications. You still use Axios, but on the API layer of Vuex actions, because it's just easier to abstract it and refactor it. Because when people used Axios on the components, especially without Axios instance, it was kind of a nightmare to scale this application or kind of abstract any changes.
Right. Got it. And so so for example, the way it would work for a smaller scale application is that I would use Axios at the component level itself, and then when I'm kind of moving towards like the services or that API layer Vuex actions pattern, I would instead kind of just maybe fire an action from the UI component level, and then the API call and the state management happens in a different module in one place.
Yep.
Is that the right understanding? Okay, got it. Makes sense. And before, like suppose you don't have a GraphQL API to kind of fetch data and whatnot in Nuxt. What are the kinds of different options that people have, and like what are the different approaches that people take?
I don't know. I think most people are just kind of still with REST APIs, and I think as well it's the lack of knowledge, or maybe even our fault, the lack of documentation that shows how easy it is to use GraphQL. Because obviously GridSum has GraphQL set up, so they kind of like have this, if you're going to use GraphQL, they go to GridSum and they don't use Nuxt, right? Because we don't have it like straight away automatically included. So yeah, I think we have to work a lot more on showing people how easy it is, and especially like, I mean, Hasura obviously is so simple to use, and because I can create a backend, an API, and I'm like not a backend developer, so I can do it. You can do it.
Yeah, but sometimes, especially like especially if you're like maybe you're like modernizing like a front end application, and backend developers, bless their hearts, we love them so much, but we love them so much that we don't want to talk to them, keep them in like little glass cases, and we don't want to talk to them, and so maybe they've given us a REST endpoint, and maybe we're using and we have to use REST, right? So in those cases, like, do people typically use like they use Nuxt along with the Vuex actions and Axios? Is that the typical pattern, or with Nuxt is there like a different way, or is there a different recommended approach to do that kind of API integration? Like, do you have a different kind of plugin, or is the mental model a little bit different from traditional like Vue actions or Vuex actions?
Yeah, so basically just like the Axios module or the HTTP module. So that module is already included, so you don't have to actually include it, whereas the Axios, when you have to install it, etc. So we're kind of like changing our documentation towards the HTTP module because it's already there, simple to use. But you can obviously throw a package on top, and then you've got another package which is Axios, which is also great, but you don't need to use it. And so kind of like going on those roads.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, no, that makes sense. For folks who are kind of maybe new to Vue or thinking about migrating to Vue, right? Would you say that the way that you've traditionally thought about API integrations, and it's a question to both of you, right? Like, because for example, I've only just been exploring Vue, right? I'm kind of more familiar with the well, I don't know if anybody remembers like Flux and Flumux from the early React days, and even before that, there used to be a library called Flight by Twitter for this kind of UI componentization, which was based on jQuery, and so I've been using systems like that, then started using React for a while, and then only recently I've been kind of looking at Vue, but I've not had a chance to build something full-fledged with it. When you kind of think about these different front-end ecosystems, and you think about like the process of API integration and kind of integrating an API and using that to modify local state and do stuff, do you think there's something like, are there like important things to be aware of when you think about Vue? Is it like a different mental model, or is it largely kind of a similar mental model when it comes to other front-end frameworks from your experiences? Natalia?
I think it's mostly common. Vue is not something very specific in these terms. It has the same architectural principles, so I can't find anything very specific to Vue.
Got it. Oh, that's good to know. And then do you think like, how has, when you started using GraphQL, did GraphQL kind of change the way that you thought about API integration at all? Like, how did you, like, what was kind of the starting point for you to start integrating GraphQL? Did it change the way that you thought about the way you structured your Vue app? Did it kind of encourage you, like for a small app, were you thinking about like, let's just have Axios, let's just replace that with the GraphQL call? Or did GraphQL kind of encourage you to say, no, we should definitely have an API layer and we should move towards services and Vuex actions? Like, what were those first steps with GraphQL like for you guys?
I'm going to talk from a different point of view, where it's, before I was in Nuxt, I was in an agency. So in an agency, we have the typical front-end team and the back-end team.
Right.
So it meant when you were building the application, you could only do so much, go so far, and then you had to wait for the backend team to come on board, to be on the same level. And it slows down the whole process of like shipping your application, because you have two teams that don't work together really, you know, and as much as you say, okay, they have a contract, they're going to create it and they're not going to change it, they do. And, you know, things go back and forward. And it's a very slow process. So to be able to have the same team, the same people that can build the front end and the back end, integrate it, make the changes, it just changes the whole ballgame.
Right, got it. And in kind of like, you know, maybe like one aspect there is that, you know, you have like the way I think about it, for example, is that if you have like REST endpoints, right? The REST endpoints are it's not that GraphQL necessarily gives you a new API, right? It's more that it kind of gives you a new API to query a more precise slice of data for which you don't need a unique REST endpoint. It's not kind of magical in the sense of like if you always, it's not like if you have a new kind of domain model, right? You have a new table that's popped up or a new concept that's popped up in your API. You would still have to implement that new concept on REST or on GraphQL. It's just that instead of having to make like a dozen REST API calls or get or wait for the team to give you an optimized REST endpoint, instead of doing that, you can you kind of have the flexibility of querying that slice of data, right? So it's that back and forth is that kind of slice of data that you're avoiding. You're avoiding that iteration on that perfect slice of data that you want, right? So and that has a huge impact. That has a huge impact on the application that you're building, right? In terms of the speed at which it loads, or the minimizing kind of the footprint of data that you're getting, right? And stuff like that. So you know that makes a lot of sense. And Natalia, for you, like any kind of experiences that speak out to you, and how that has changed from, you know, before GraphQL to getting into GraphQL?
Totally. I would say it's interesting because on the first step, when you migrated from REST to the GraphQL, not that many changes you made in the architecture of your own front-end application. You can still use the same architecture, the same level. You can even use the same access if you want. You're not obliged to have any specific GraphQL client. What definitely changes here is when you have a REST API, you usually write a good amount of helpers to shape your data, because you fetch this huge amount of data. You fetch, like, for GitLab, it could be like JSON with 200 rows, just because that's the way we have data from our REST API. And obviously, you need a set of helpers to shape it up and to provide them to components. With GraphQL, this amount of logic is definitely smaller. It's easier to work with. And then if you go to more complicated applications and more complicated data, the huge change in architecture happens if you start using Apollo. I never used Relay. I hope it's kind of the same. But with Apollo, the architecture definitely changes a lot.
Got it. And what is that kind of change, right? Is that change that's something that you can make incrementally, or do you have to think about your application architecture in a slightly different way?
You can totally do this incrementally, but the main change is data now is very close to components. It's like component fetches what component needs, be it cache or API. You don't need this API layer anymore. You don't need these Vuex actions, because your API layer is already in the Apollo. It's Apollo client. It's doing it's a kind of black magic. It's doing for you.
Got it. No, that's I think that's very interesting, and I think like there's a lot to kind of double click when you talk about like this nature of data being close to components, right? And stuff like that. But one of the other things that I quickly wanted to touch on was, are you folks using TypeScript? And has the nature of the fact that GraphQL is typed, has that had an impact, positive or negative, on the way that you work with both with API integration and your front ends?
You just hit a pain point for us, because Vue 2 was not that TypeScript friendly as Vue 3 is going to be. Right. And we definitely needed to make some good effort to type everything properly. We are just waiting for Vue 3 because it's playing with TypeScript so much nicer. And we finally just waiting for this to have GraphQL code generation or Apollo code generation, whatever,
Right.
to have types.
Right. No, that makes sense. And so right now, are you using Vue 2 and TypeScript at all, or is everything are you using kind of JavaScript without types?
Not at GitLab, because we had a huge discussion about this, and we decided to wait until Vue 3. It's an open discussion. Actually, I'm not like sharing something that is under NDA, because we decided that the effort we need to put to migrate to TypeScript right now is not worthy the benefits we could have.
Got it. Interesting. And what about you, Debbie? Any experience with kind of types and TypeScript and any pros and cons there?
I want to use TypeScript in Angular because you have to, but not because I'm against TypeScript. I always remember like Chris Fritz, for example, always said, why do you need TypeScript when this just works? So keep it simple. And I kind of liked his way of thinking, right? But I do think that TypeScript does have a place, and I do need to learn it for sure. I think it's very valuable, but I haven't got around to working with it. So although like a lot of the code in Nuxt is written in TypeScript, I'm not involved in that part. So we do have a module for TypeScript. So if you want to write TypeScript in Nuxt, you can, for example. But I personally haven't. Got it.
Yeah, I've been on the fence with TypeScript as well for a long time, which is yeah. I'm like I really like just being able to do whatever in JavaScript, and I totally understand why that doesn't work, because if you have a evolving code base and a large code base, you kind of need some information to go away from the minds of the people into the code, right? That's very important. We use Haskell on the back end, which is kind of like the 500-pound gorilla of like typed and functional languages, right? So it's very like it's very ironic that I like that kind of a
freedom.
I like that kind of freedom, because I think I appreciate that freedom more. I'm like, I have seen the dark side of the compiler not letting you do what you want, right? Just refusing to let you write your code. Whereas I can just do whatever I want in JavaScript. So it's interesting, right? It's like that balance is very interesting, where it's like I almost want to write code that I know I will throw away in a few weeks, and it's fine. It's just going to be so fast moving that it's fine. But no, I completely empathize with that feeling. But I think TypeScript is going. I think TypeScript is and types in general are they do save a lot of pain, especially for kind of like slightly larger projects or projects where you have multiple people coming in, right? It avoids a lot of like this documentation headache and unnecessary testing headache, right? It's like you don't have to write a whole category of tests almost. So that's that's always cool and amazing. But kind of moving to the component stuff, and I think there's a lot of talk about there, which is that this idea of having data close to components, right, is very interesting. And I think there's two kind of things there, right? The first is that when we think about that data being close to components, very very often it's that the data that you have on the front end side, right? Especially if you want to kind of free the front end team to do as much as possible by themselves and not interact with the backend folks at all. There's going to be a fair amount of client-side state that starts evolving, right? That represents the state of the client, which doesn't come from the remote data source at all, right? Maybe it's like a loading state, or maybe it's like a button state, or maybe it's like I do something here, but it affects a component there, right? Which is purely kind of purely on the client. It's not got a remote data source kind of requirement at all. When we think about that kind of architecture shift, that with GraphQL we can start keeping data close to components. How do you deal with that local state? How do you deal with that client-side state? What has that story been like?
I mentioned Apollo, and this is an important moment because it's not GraphQL shifting you to that data close to components. Right. It's rather Apollo. And why? Because Apollo offers you a solution for this.
Right.
Because when you're doing this and when you have local state, you have actually two ways if you're using Apollo client, let's say so. You still can use it with our official state management, which is Vuex. But it would be, like Debbie said, Nuxt module is huge. Trust me, Vue library is no smaller.
Right.
Polo client is huge itself. So
Right.
if you're going to use a Polo client just to store data in Vuex, this is like, it's like using microscope just to smash some nuts. That's it.
Right.
You don't do this. Use normal HTTP client for this.
That was a fun analogy. No, got it. No, that makes sense. I mean, I've taken a look at that, and I find it like there is definitely a price to pay, right? It is a little more complex than the kind of like, if I'm right, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong. It's like kind of like you're kind of the way you would deal with a Apollo client in local state is that you're kind of saying that you're kind of defining a part of your schema on the client and some of those resolvers at the client, right? You're kind of defining some queries and some mutations and some extensions to your state at the client level, right? And it does seem like it does feel a little more complex than just using native Vuex, right? By the way, is Vuex the right way of saying it, or is it Vuex? What is the right way to is it Vuex or is it Vuex?
It's Vuex. It's officially Vuex, even though I name it Vuex. And I would argue that it's more complex. I would say that most people that use Vue are used to use Vuex, and it's like Stockholm syndrome. When you use Vuex for a long time, you stop noticing this boilerplate. You don't feel it like a boilerplate. It's a normal thing. I just need to set it up. Everyone does the same. Right. And when people switch to Apollo client, like, oh, it's so verbose. But even if you measure it with the strings of the code,
right, it would be very similar.
Almost the same. Yeah.
Got it. No, that's interesting. That's interesting because I think like the other kind of approach is like at the extreme, like so like maybe if you take two extreme ends, right? Like the one extreme end is that you think of GraphQL, the GraphQL schema, not just as the remote data source, but you also augment it and it becomes your local state as well, right? And it's now a part of that local state manipulation is done locally, and a part of that is done remotely, right? And so that's one way to think about it, right? And on the other extreme, it's like saying that the other extreme of the way of doing this is kind of maybe the more traditional API integration style of doing things, where you're kind of like, you talked about the API layer or the service layer, right? Where you can say, what we do is we'll deal with local state, and local state is kind of our source of truth. It's kind of our collection of the way the type of the state looks and the way the state looks. And what we do is all of the APIs that we have will kind of go in and modify just the local state, and then everybody just deals with that local state, right? And then the API integration part is just modifying local state, right? And those are kind of the two opposing like ends of the spectrum, right? And both are feasible. And I'm sure there's kind of an incremental path to move from one to the other as well, if you want to, either towards the GraphQL side or towards the local state, which is getting API, which has an API integration, which has an API layer side. How do you do you have any thoughts on how to think about which side of the spectrum to lean on, right? Or when to say that, here's an application where I would prefer to be local state heavy. Here's an application that I would prefer to be like model that local state in GraphQL. How do you think about that? Do you think about like the developer experience? Do you think about from a performance point of view? What are kind of the dimensions that you think about when you think about the spectrum?
I have a very simple measurement for this. You should measure the part of the state you want to use that comes from the API, how API dependent you are. Right. If it's a big part coming from the API, that in this case on Vuex, you will create lots of actions and mutations just to save this data and to change it. Yeah. While with Apollo client, this is done automatically for you. You don't even need to write a resolver. You query the data, it's stored to the cache for you. So if you have like backend heavy application and you need to sync up with backend, you should go in my opinion, if you're using GraphQL, it's a good idea to go with a Polo client. Of course, on a certain scale of the application, as Debbie already said. If it's just a very simple app and it's small by itself and you want to add the whole Apollo layer to this just for nothing, that doesn't make sense.
Got it.
If you have like a rich user interaction application, I can think about editors. Like, right? You have some kind of specific editor. You want like lots of changes in the local state, and you just need to sync up with backend maybe once when you save it.
Right.
Maybe it's a good idea to go with Vuex.
Got it. No, that makes sense. That's super helpful. Debbie, do you have any thoughts on the on this kind of when to use GraphQL versus when to use GraphQL with the full and versus that? And I guess the other part of the question is also specifically with Nuxt. Are there particular patterns for managing like the local state and like modeling local state, which is not dependent on not dependent on the API at all? It's purely a UI side thing.
So I think Natalia answered that question very, very well. And obviously in Nuxt, we use the Vuex store as well, when you need to, etc. But I want to touch on what you said about the components and having the data closer to the components. So if you used Nuxt before in the past, you will know that with async data, for example, we weren't able to have the data at component level. It was at page level. And that was a pain point for many developers. So it was a big problem. So now with the fetch, which was released, 3-4 months ago or something like that, now you can actually get your data straight into your component. And that has been a game changer in Nuxt because it's needed so badly because you're not passing down from one to the other, etc. So I think having the data so close and calling the GraphQL and having the API, having everything right there in the component is definitely a plus factor.
Got it. That makes sense. I mean, I think the interesting thing there and is for example, imagine that we have like a UI, and the UI is showing us a profile page of the user, and then maybe the last 10 addresses of this user, like it's an e-commerce profile page. I want to see my recent addresses or something, right? Or recent orders maybe. And so if I have this kind of UI, like the component hierarchy might be, I have like a user component, and then that has a orders component, and that's a list of orders, and then each order component renders the order data, right? So now there are kind of multiple ways that I can think about doing the API integration for this, right? One way, for example, to think about it is kind of what Debbie was just referring to, which is that we can have kind of a page level API fetch, right? Which is that I'll make a single API call, whether it's a GraphQL query or REST endpoint, that captures all of the data that I need to render. So I'll make a GraphQL query that has user, ID, name, whatever, nickname, and then orders, and then I'll say, last 10, and then order ID, order date, and then products or brands or whatever, right? So I can create a full GraphQL query that represents everything I need for these components, and then make that at the top level. And here I'm kind of using the benefit of GraphQL, which is to say, I don't need different endpoints. I'm making one query. I'm fetching all of that data, great on the network, make one fetch, get the API result, render it. It's all great, right? Whereas when we're talking about this component separation with data, then there could be another way of thinking about this, right? Which is to say that, for the top level component, I'll make the user query. And then for the orders component, I'll make an orders query, which is separate. And so that the people who are building the order cards or whatever, right, they can kind of declare their data query separately. And then at the top level, I can declare my query separately. A, does that make sense? And B, how do you think about that problem? You know what I mean, right? Because like when you want to keep the data queries close to the components, you'll end up making more API calls than what you would have if you had declared the data dependency at the full page level, right? How do you think about that? Does that am I making sense? Is this yeah?
Yeah. Yes. It's pretty much how I would do it, is put it at like the component level, because it's easier to manage. And then if you need to like take one thing away, you're not like, I don't know, right. It's just there. And then with static sites, for example, we're just making that call once, and then it's made and done. So I'm not really worried about having to call it on every time you change a page, because it's already there.
Right. And that makes sense. What about Indra? How do you think about this kind of difference and the trade-off here?
So yeah, we had a similar task, and there is a third way.
Right.
You can have a first query that you only need to display the list of these components, let's say a list of cards, right? But you don't fetch all the details on a certain card. And we have this task because we had a list of designs, which is images. And images are heavy. Some of the images are really heavy and not optimized. So for the general view, for the big component, we make it like you said, a page level query. We fetch everything we need. We fetch thumbnails and only show them. But if user wants to have more details, they will have one more query, and this is the query close to component. So if they click on the card, they have this card expanded, and you have a new query, but thanks to Apollo, you're not fetching the same data. You already have a part of the data fetched for this card by the page level, right? You only fetch in this heavy image link or whatever you want from this design. And what is good, if you close it, it never disappears. It saves on Apollo cache. So you still have data close to component, but it's not like all the data. You only fetch the data you need. And this is the benefit of GraphQL as well, right? Only fetch what you need.
Got it. So from like a development standpoint, like the way we would develop this is, let's say you are the person who's building that page level component, and I'm the person who's building like these child order card components. Like, what is the what would you recommend as like how do we separate this out? Will you also write you will write a GraphQL query that fetches user data and card ID name. And then I want to make a query where I'll fetch card, but ID name, like more data, description, images, right? Whatever, right? How will we do that? Do I need to care about like the GraphQL query that you are making and how you are using the Apollo client cache, or do I not need to care about it? Do I use it independently? What is that experience like?
So if you're using Apollo, you would need to care about what is already in the cache and what would you need to fetch. Okay. Just to not overfetch. So this will need some kind of coordination, or at least use an Apollo DevTool so you can see what's in the cache, what I can make. And honestly, I was a person who at first has written the page query that fetched everything, like all the heavy data. And I would say use your own like common sense. Because if you're fetching too much, you will see this and you will be able to refactor this. This is not that hard.
Right. Interesting. No, very interesting. I think I understand. I kind of understand what you're saying. Right? I think the sorry, just a second. I think the interesting thing here is that one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is like is GraphQL Fragments for kind of dealing with this, right? And especially I think Relay's approach on this is very mature. And I would love to see kind of those kinds of approaches coming in as well, where the idea is like the way it works with Relay, for example, is that, let's say you're writing the page level component and you make a GraphQL query. What I would do in my sub component is not use a GraphQL query. I would just write a fragment. And then what happens is that when this whole page is rendered, my fragment is automatically included in your GraphQL query for the first fetch. If that component is supposed to be rendered, if the detailed view is supposed to be rendered, my fragment will be included and the full thing will be fetched. And then if I only need to work on my data, my fragment can automatically be converted into a query. Like the fragment turns into a query, and then it becomes like a specific load, right? And that's because the GraphQL API, like a relay compatible GraphQL API, has support for something called nodes. Right, where you can fetch any sub-element of your data just by itself. You don't have to fetch it as a part of a graph, right? So let's say, for example, you have users and users have orders, right? If I need to render more information about the orders, I need a top-level query for order, right? I need to be able to do query order ID1 or something, right? Maybe your API doesn't provide that. Maybe your API only provides orders as a part of the user object. You know what I mean? Maybe it is nested by definition, but if I have a relay compatible API, I can make a node query. I can make a query to fetch just that part, just one order ID with more data, with description and image links on demand, right? And the coordination aspect of coordinating with the person building a child's component and the person building the parent component, they don't have to explicitly coordinate. The coordination kind of happens automatically, and I think that represents I think solving that problem well, I think, is very useful, because then what happens is that then we get best of both worlds, right? Yeah. Then we get like you get exactly, you get independence, right? You get independence from backend developers, you get independence from your front-end developers. Basically, you end up a person who's just lonely and has no friends, right? And so you and so
but your part of the application works.
Yeah, but your part of the application works. Right? So what if you don't have any friends? At least your part of the application works. And so you're kind of now able to build your UI components, right? Without caring about the performance impact. You're like, hey, here's my UI component, here's my fragment, I don't care. Everything else just works. Whether this is going to be part of a big query, whether this is an independent query that's made by itself, right? I find that abstraction very powerful, right? But it's very sad that the Relay client is only with React right now. But it would be amazing if that kind of comes to other frameworks like Vue and stuff as well. So I think there's a lot of exciting kind of stuff there, which becomes very useful once I think people get into the nitty-gritties of like the complexities of like, hey, should we do X with GraphQL? Should we do Y with GraphQL? So that's something that I'm pretty excited about. But on that topic of kind of GraphQL fragments, have you folks had any experiences with GraphQL fragments and stuff like that?
Yeah, we're using them really widely. Unfortunately, not at the level of Relay.
Right.
And it's especially sadly because the backend API, our GraphQL API, uses Relay connections. So we have adjacent nodes. So basically, we could play on the front end with like Relay level fragments, but we use them. We not just like deeply connect components with fragments, but you still need to make a query, right? Like you cannot just separate it. But we are using fragments really, and we try to name fragments at the same as components and include them in queries conditionally. So this is still kind of a level of abstraction you could allow with Apollo.
Right.
And it works really nicely for us. And yeah, fragments, like, it's a miracle, because if something changes, you only change a fragment and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's nice. Yeah, I think the experience around using fragments can definitely be improved, and I think bringing those ideas either into Apollo or however, right, I think would be very interesting. That would be very powerful. No, that makes a lot of sense. What are kind of some of the things that as you've worked with GraphQL and Vue that you feel are missing from the ecosystem, or things that could definitely be made better? Debbie, any thoughts from the Nuxt ecosystem or from just using GraphQL in general?
I think basically awareness of like like materials in general. I think people still have the thoughts that GraphQL is difficult. I don't know GraphQL, therefore I can't use it. So they stay away from it, and they stay with the REST API, etc. And GraphQL is actually not that difficult. I'm actually writing a course which is just being released at the moment for Vue School. So this is going to be great, because now we have GraphQL and Vue School, and that's kind of at least a starting point for courses, because there is, I don't know, Natalia, if you know any, but there's pretty much none in the Vue ecosystem for courses for GraphQL. And I think that's something we're missing. And then I'm only doing like a basic stuff. So I don't know, Natalia, you need to follow up on the whole Apollo stuff, because that's like another course all on its own, right?
Yes, a bit. I would say we have a nice course, not a course, okay, let's say tutorial from Hasura, by the way. And trust me, Tanmai, it's like, I'm not saying this because you're here, but I linked this so many times to my own colleagues at GitLab asking like, where do I find some introductional guide? And I was like, there is one on Hasura, because I remember I was reviewing it. I know it's nice, and I know it's really nice to grasp the feeling of GraphQL. So I was like, go check it there. Like, no lies. And what about like missing part? Except awareness, I would say for me the biggest missing piece was that Apollo develops React testing library. They have a nice way to test components that contain like Apollo queries and mutations. For Vue, it was non-existent thing. So it was, for me, it was like do-it-yourself approach. I was trying to figure it out for half a year before I write this article, just to mock Apollo client. Because Apollo, as you said, it comes with a price, right? And the price is too much magic. It works magically for you. But
Right.
if it fails, if you want to test it, this is too much magic, and you need to understand how to work with this. So yeah, testing part was like totally missing for me on Vue, and second is rather on Vue than on GraphQL side. That's why I'm waiting for Vue 3. This is TypeScript, because GraphQL and TypeScript, like peanut butter and jelly, they play so well together with all the code generation.
At least if you're into butter and jelly, like if you like them at the same time. at least in that case. But no, I think that makes that makes a lot of sense, and I think and thank you for that. I think with on the Hasura.io/learn, we've tried to put together a few courses on just on vanilla Vue and GraphQL, and also introduction to GraphQL, and then I think with a few more courses like Debbie's talking about with with Nuxt and whatnot. I think that's going to help get people onboarded onto using GraphQL and Vue quite a bit. I think the topic around kind of testing with Vue and GraphQL is very interesting. Would love to kind of understand that in a little more detail, Natalia. Like, what is kind of what does testing mean if you have if you're kind of working with a GraphQL endpoint? Like, what are you really testing, and what is the purpose of that testing? And then B, what is that testing experience now like with some of the latest work that you've been doing?
Okay, so basically, what do you want from GraphQL side? What do you want to test if you have a Vue component? Right. First of all, for Axios, we have something that calls Axios mock. So you can mock a client, you can mock a query, you can resolve a promise, you can mock a response, and then you check what is displayed when this query is in loading state, when the promise is not resolved, right? Right? What is displayed when query is resolved? You mock the response, obviously, but you need to check how it's rendered, what component is showing. You need to check the error state as well. So you use promise reject on Axios mock, and you check like, okay, I have an error. What should be displayed here? How component handles this? And for Apollo, the problem was, if you don't mock Apollo client, how would you check this? Of course, you can set everything to data. You can say like, okay, this is loading, but this is very shallow test. This doesn't help you with, let's say, Apollo cache updates. You cannot just trigger the cache updates without having a cache. To have a cache, you need to mock a client. And this becomes more and more complicated if you can't mock a client. And with Vue, it wasn't this obvious how to do this, how to provide this client, how to write a correct test.
Right.
Yeah, so when you mock a client, everything is very nicely playing. You check loading state, you check success state, you check error state, and even cache updates are testable in this case.
Got it. And so what is that experience of setting up the mock client like? Is it basically that you set up the testing framework and then you provide sample responses to the GraphQL queries, or you specify like a mock data graph for the full GraphQL schema? Like, what is that experience like? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there are two different levels. First, let's separate like Apollo client and GraphQL testing itself, because you can mock Apollo schema and you can check your queries. You don't care about Apollo at this point. You just want to check, okay, if my query is actually fitting this schema, will schema return anything correct? So you mock a schema, you send a query, you can send it with, just GQL query, with Axios, with whatever you want to do. And you will see how this schema is responding. This is important because if you don't use any kind of linting, any kind of Apollo DevTools that shows that this field is not existent on this schema, you will have like non-testable part. Second part is actually what Apollo is doing. And this part also covers Apollo cache. Because when you send a query, when you have a successful response, you want to be sure this is in the cache. If you send a mutation, if you have an update hook, you want to be sure that mutation updated the cache, because this will lead to rendering the UI. And this is you want to test. Actually, it's like, does UI render or not? So these two levels should be covered in tests.
Got it. Makes sense. No, that's so helpful. And what's kind of the testing story like with Nuxt Debbie on both kind of like the GraphQL side and without GraphQL side as well? Is that how does that work, and what's that story like?
So obviously I work on like the Nuxt website and the documentation, so not the Nuxt.JS framework itself, right? Obviously that's very heavily tested and I'm not part of that project. But in the website, we're doing the whole new website. We've done a whole revamp of everything. We didn't have testing. Why? I don't know. I mean, maybe it just wasn't needed. It's just a little website, you know. And I've recently started to add testing for a very simple reason that we were sending a tweet out and we were basically saying, sign up for our newsletter. And the newsletter was broken, right? So nobody could actually sign up because someone changed something in the HTTP module. So it wasn't like a code that you could see in a pull request that they modified something.
Right.
Right. So it was a very simple thing that you would never have picked it up in a PR, but a test would have picked it up. Right. So we now have added tests. So I'm using Cypress for testing. So we've added like a lot of end-to-end testing, and that's just the start on that side of thing. In the framework itself, I don't know, because that's kind of like a whole nother ball game.
Right. No. That makes sense. And I think that also kind of like it kind of there's like so many different layers of testing that you can do, right? Which is one is kind of like what I was referring to, which is you're kind of testing the client side logic of the way you're handling responses, the different kinds of responses you can get from that query result, and the way you're updating your cache. And then of course there's kind of the more integration testing side of things, where you assume that the API is running, so you don't kind of mock it, but you just go through all of the different user flows, right? Yeah. And there's a little bit of an overlap, I guess, with both of them, right? So Natalia, have you had any experience with the integration testing as well? Do you do that as well, where you're kind of integrating with live APIs, and then do you define a boundary of saying that, well, these are the bits that we're going to do with mocking the client, and these are the bits that we're going to do without mocking the client? How have you separated that?
Don't even make me started on integration end-to-end tests for GitLab, because this is our spec. This is Ruby, and this is so painful to write these tests for the front-end developer.
Right. This is true.
So yeah, we definitely would do this part of testing. I'm so jealous that we could use Cypress, because I want to use Cypress too, but unfortunately I'm doomed to use our spec.
Right. Got it. No, that makes sense. And so do you have a boundary of like things that you decide to do with our spec and with the on integration testing, and there are things that you do there and there are things that you do there, or are they completely independent? Is there an overlap? What is that like?
They're completely independent for us, and the main rule of thumb is for our unit and integration tests on the front end, we don't have an API running. We just need to check with a mocked schema. We don't have this schema somewhere on the API. We use mocked schema that we have locally with an introspection query, and it's like stored in the local repository. So test against it, and that's it. And for all the end-to-end tests, obviously we have a running API, so we are hitting this API and checking the user flow.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And would you say that like from a before and after GraphQL point of view, the impact on kind of testability has, what has that impact been? Has it been positive, negative? Has it improved testability? Like, what has that been like? Like before and after GraphQL?
It definitely improved for the front-end side, because when you have this schema, it's like you actually have everything you need to test queries. When you have an Axios request for the certain API, you have nothing. You cannot test it on the front end. It's only for end-to-end tests, if it hits or not. Here, we can check our queries. We can check the shape of queries with a mock schema. So this improves the front-end testing experience a lot on these queries.
Okay, got it. Yeah, no,
Natalia, can I ask you just a question?
Sure.
So on the Vue docs, do you have Cypress testing? Do you have testing on it on the website?
No, we have.
No, you can use it. You're a core team member. You can just bring it in.
we have VuePress, so VuePress is tested itself as a framework, so we just compile our docs and we're happy about that.
Hope for the best.
that makes sense. But also, like, I'm guessing for like the docs thing, it's largely static content, right? So there's not maybe like too much of like the end-to-end testing that's needed, right? In as much as it would be for like a dynamic API driven kind of application.
It depends, because if you check Svelte documentation, for example, that part of it is built as an interactive tutorial. And I would say if you have this part, you would need end-to-end and unit tests. This is like for sure.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
And we released our new beta docs literally last week. And I made a mistake and we basically killed the Japanese site. So we hadn't got tests. I hadn't got the tests written for that. And we had like the ISO code wrong. So it wasn't, rendering that page at all. So sometimes you think it's not important. It's just a documentation site, but there are, they're very important things to test sometimes that like it's worth adding on.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Especially because that documentation and learning experience as kind of like frameworks and API integration and GraphQL and whatnot becomes more and more complex. It's like the ways that you're using things and also as kind of like more and more people are accessing it from like different kinds of backgrounds. They're coming from different languages, right? That the documentation learning experience also has to become better, right? And as that happens, your documentation goes from being like a static site or like quote unquote static site into something that actually has like a experience around it that is has a lot of dynamism to it. So that definitely is important, right? That makes a lot of sense. I think as we kind of come to a close on this, would love to turn it over to you folks to ask you for your picks for the day, the week, the month. Technical picks, non-technical picks, things that you're looking at that you want other people to check out. Either technical or non-technical. Debbie, if you'd like to go first.
Really? Pressure. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a book that I bought recently that I can't live without now. It's fantastic. And mainly because I sent a tweet out recently about that I sleep enough and I eat healthy or something. And then people were like, really, you eat and sleep? And I'm like, what? Like, I don't know, there's a stereotypical thing that all developers are spending all night coding and don't have a normal life, right? So this book is Run Fast, Eat Slow. And because I do a lot of running as well, and there's two of them. There's Run Fast, Eat Slow, and Run Fast, Cook Fast, Eat Slow. And it's got some really, really cool recipes that you can make really, really quickly. So when you're hungry and you want a snack, you've got healthy snacks at home. It's easy to make. And I think like people have the whole health, food, and sport as something that we don't have time to do. And I think everyone needs to make time for it. So that's what I would recommend.
That's awesome. And I'd say, and Natalia, picks from you, and also a question on behalf of everybody. When is Vue 3 coming on?
Okay. First of all, I want to say. Okay. First of all, I want to say, Debbie, do you really sleep? Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Every night, it's like, yeah, no, I'm gonna write a blog post on it because seriously, like my tweets sometimes get some likes and replies and retweets, but this one got the most, and I'm like, seriously, like not my Nuxt stuff, but you want to know about my sleeping habits and my running habits and my eating habits? Okay. I'm gonna change careers.
It's just so funny. People think we don't have life, right?
Yeah.
It's like
this is also true. I think there's like this. It almost seems sometimes like there's this encouragement that if you're not living a normal life, like if you are living a normal life as a developer, really, are you even a developer?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not fun. That's a little bit harmful.
Yeah.
I destroyed a lot of my life in the early days thinking like that. It was terrible. It's bad.
Yeah. I think we all do. So people don't forget, eat and sleep and having normal life, especially if you're working hard.
Yeah. And you can decide whether you want friends or not. That's a whole different discussion. Like if you're using GraphQL or component,
if you're allowed to see them.
That's on you. No pressure. But even sleep well. That's important.
That's so true. And switching to picks, we recently released Vue CLI version 4.5, and what I want to say here is this is the first really easy way to set up Vue 3 with Webpack locally. Previously, it needed some tricks to do so. Right now, if you want to play with like fully featured Vue 3 on your machine, just try to install it, play around, report bugs. Probably there will be some bugs, and it's a good moment to report them right now because Vue 3 is soon. So as we promised, we will release early August. We're already in the early August, so it will be really, really soon. obviously I can't disclose a date because otherwise I will be punished and kicked out. No, of course I won't be, but I can share. But it's really soon.
Yeah, you will get wildly popular on Twitter for both the right and wrong reasons at the same time. That's what's going to happen.
That's so true.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, folks, for being here. It was great seeing you both again. And see you online. And see you see you. So hopefully we'll talk more about Vue and GraphQL over the coming weeks and months. I'm excited to try out Vue 3 and TypeScript and GraphQL and put all of them together. So that should be fun. But otherwise, thank you everybody else for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this, and see you next week when we talk about GraphQL and Angular. That's it from us, folks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Get some sleep.